Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. It's part of our FAS project looking at biodiversity and alternative crops. Earlier this month, we had another webinar which showed some examples of businesses that use biodiversity to build their business. Tonight, we're going to look at why everyone should be looking at biodiversity on their farm, what benefits it can bring, and some practical tips on how to make positive changes in biodiversity. Our speakers tonight are three SRUC colleagues, and each are taking a different part of this puzzle. Firstly, we have Mads Fischer-Møller, Professor of Food Policy at SRUC's Future Foods Farming System Research Challenge Centre, and he'll be talking about how policy is likely to drive change on Scottish farms regarding biodiversity. Ceri Ritchie, Principal Consultant at SAC Consulting and a specialist in food and drink business management and marketing. And Ceri will discuss sort of marketing trends and how they're likely also to drive biodiversity agenda through the products that are sold in the retailers. Also, we have Alex Peary, who is also a consultant, a farm business consultant with SAC Consulting based at the Ayr office. Alex has been involved in several projects concerning environmental management, including the AgriCalc program, which is our carbon assessment tool, Farming for a Better Climate, and Net Zero Arran. So Alex will be offering some practical tips and advice around improving biodiversity on the farm, which he's been doing with some of his clients. This event is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the FAS website in the next couple of weeks. So if you happen to join late or have to leave early, then you will be able to catch up with it later. So we're going to hear the three presentations first, and then we'll have about half an hour of questions at the end, if there are half an hour's worth of questions. So please keep your microphones muted throughout, but if you have any questions, then please put them on the chat, and we'll pick them up with the speakers once they're finished. So without further ado, let's make a start with Mads, who is going to talk about the policy driving biodiversity in Scotland at the moment. Thanks, Mads.
And then from the top. Okay, so I'm Mads Fischer-Møller, Professor in Food Policy, and I'm from Denmark, came to Scotland last year. I joined SRUC to, kind of like help with new ideas from not least Scandinavia and how that might help Scotland. So I'll be talking a little bit about like the global perspective, what's happening in this area policy-wise globally, what's happening in some select countries, what's happening here, and what's happening in the market. But I'll go quite big picture, also because I'm not a farmer, I'm not a biodiversity expert of any sort, I'm a political scientist, so I'll be on those kind of levels, but hopefully fuel some discussion, and I'm looking forward to questions in the end. So that's it. As we know, food has a heavy toll on the planet. This just shows how crazy it is. Of all the mammals in the world, 60% is livestock, 36% is human, and 4% is all the rest. So we kind of like the food system is having a tremendous impact on biodiversity already. So from that perspective, we need to change the food system if we want to preserve biodiversity. At the moment, we are only preserving a very few species very well within the food system. I won't go much in detail with this, but we know that the food system has a very big part of our total climate emissions. Around 33% of total greenhouse gas emissions come from food, most of that from actually deforestation and cows. But the global picture, we can see that for the first time, I think, ever in the global food discussions, agroecology and new approaches to farming that isn't just like the Green Revolution 2.0 is really starting to come into focus. So we just had this September UN Food System Summit, where for the first time ever, all the ministers, all the prime ministers from all nations of the world met to only talk about food and the fact that we need to change food and farming. We need a profound transformation of agricultural systems, including kind of like changing the dominant green revolution approach and changing it towards more agroecological practices. That was kind of like a resounding speak coming over and over again from all the heads of state in the world. And that's quite strong. There's really new energy in this space that haven't been there really ever, I don't think. Also, out of this big meeting came the fact that all of this needs to be developed nationally through dialogues with farmers. We can't just have one top-down approach that works everywhere. We need to develop the future of agriculture together, and kind of like an inclusive agriculture. I was fortunate enough to be present at the climate conference earlier in the month. And if you look at what's in the climate conference from a food and biodiversity point of view, well, there's actually quite a lot about biodiversity. There was a whole nature day with quite some strong commitments, but also from kind of what will affect food and food production the most. There's a pledge about 30% methane reduction by 2030 and stop for deforestation by 2030. But agriculture, and in particular food, is not really present in kind of like the national plans, as you can see there in the bottom right. There's absolutely nothing about diets or food waste or anything in kind of like what the countries actually bring and say, this is how we will fix the climate emergency. So food is still undervalued when it comes to tackling the big global challenge around climate change. But that doesn't mean that a lot of things didn't happen that also affects us. So there are net zero pledges. There's a lot of protesters talking about going vegan, etc. We see not least commitments from key financial institutions. For instance, the FAIR initiative that says, okay, we really need to change how we invest in farming. So even though COP itself haven't really changed, it doesn't have much text about food and farming, a lot of the side things around deforestation and around kind of like the future of food still will have an impact in the food system going forward. So there's kind of like an emerging global consensus that we need some kind of more dietary diversity, more agroecological practices. That's needed in order to meet both global climate, health, and biodiversity targets. There's also this, I don't know if it's a resigning spirit, but kind of like nobody really knows how to do it. We all know where we need to go, but it's a very complicated system, so it's really hard to do. So it has to be a slow, multi-actor, almost movement mobilization, but at the moment probably driven by some key market forces that can see, okay, the future has to look different from the past, because otherwise we can't stay within planetary boundaries when it comes to biodiversity loss and climate change. So what's the domestic landscape here? Well, we do have a kind of like a national food strategy for England. We have like a ton of reports you can see on the left, but I'll just go to one of them, the National Food Strategy for England. When it comes to biodiversity, it does say that, well, you can see on the left-hand side, how do we actually use the UK landscape? So these are UK figures, and almost all of it, all of the productive lands are used for beef and lamb. And that also, if we add to that, how our food production and our food consumption is also taking a toll on the foreign soils. You can see that on the right side of the picture. We have like kind of almost all of UK's land mass is actually used for beef and lamb. So that's not necessarily the most efficient way of having a food system. It doesn't give the benefits we want. So there's a kind of like emerging kind of discourse down in England that we need to move away from this system that we've been knowing for so long towards a new system where the suggestion in this report is we have more high yield farmland, more semi-natural lands, and more low yield farmland. So we'll have kind of like a mix of highly industrialized agriculture, agroecological practices, and more room for nature. What's happening here in Scotland, in the Good Food Nation? well, we did see the deal from S&P and the Greens that we want to be a global leader in sustainable and regenerative agriculture. We will ensure the sector makes the emission reductions required to contribute to Scotland's world-leading emission targets. So that's kind of like the preamble regarding food in the S&P Green deal. What does that actually mean in practice? Well, they're working on kind of like the agricultural subsidy scheme post the Common Agricultural Policy. They are developing an organic action plan. They have promised to introduce Good Food Nation bill, and it has been introduced, although with very little content. And there is a lot of there's a flurry of consultations. What do we want with local food? What do we want with horticulture? But my honest assessment is that it's very limited ambition, and they don't really know where they want to go. The Scottish government don't at the moment. So what's happening around the world? Well, a lot of what's happening around the world is driven, to be honest, by net zero, by the carbon emissions pledges. So biodiversity is very much playing second fiddle in the global call for transitioning of the food system. But luckily, what's good for the for climate is oftentimes also good for biodiversity. So I'll just say that's kind of like what drives the trend around the world. In Denmark, this is the Danish Minister of Food and Agriculture. I used to be an advisor to the Danish Ministry of Food and Agriculture in my previous career, and I can say as much as I would never have been able to put a sentence like, "I do not have anything against meat as such," in the mouth of my minister. But now we have a minister who actually says, okay, our current food system isn't delivering on climate and isn't delivering on biodiversity. We need to change things radically. So there's a strong plant forward agenda with significant investment and the development of new markets. There are like invitations to join public-private partnerships. So it's very much about reduce meat to increase production of other things, and alongside that, free up room for nature, and nature will take care of the biodiversity. So that's kind of like the main kind of like trend in the Danish food discourse at the moment. But then biodiversity benefits are, of course, one of the key reasons for the Danish organic action plans, and Denmark is well leading in organics. So when the Danish government wants to support kind of like in-field biodiversity, it usually goes through the organic action plan, because organics is a way to support upfront the farmers to do to make some transitions, and then later on, instead of keep supporting the farmers directly, the consumers will reward the farmers for doing the right thing. And organics is very much more, it's definitely more about biodiversity than climate. You can actually see oftentimes that if you make like for like swaps of conventional to organic products, well, the organics will have a higher climate toll, but they will be better for biodiversity. So the main kind of like claim to fame from biodiversity point of view is organics, and then it is kind of like less but better meat that will hopefully reduce the land mass you currently use for meat production, free up some land for biodiversity that's kind of like in nature. So where's New Zealand in this? It's often a country that we kind of like compare ourselves to here. They can also see that the big global discussions in this is about plant-based proteins, about lab-grown meats, etc. So New Zealand and the New Zealand government is trying to position themselves as kind of like the good choice for meat in a changing market. So hopefully what they want is to have metrics that can show that New Zealand farmers are better both for climate and biodiversity than their peers in other countries, and hope to carve out a market for them as such. And they're investing quite heavily in research and development in this area to show that that New Zealand can also be delivering on kind of like on the green claims when it comes to its meat production. But at the same time, we can also, in New Zealand, also can see farmers who are keen to look into diversifying their food production and diversifying their income streams, and want to work more on, for instance, agroecological practices. But they're not used to it, and they don't have a good kind of like partnership around it. We also see that in Denmark. What's needed oftentimes, if you want to do something else, is how can we find collaborators in the new. There's really good structure around what you want to do in the present system, but in kind of like a future system, if you want to step into something new, who do you do it with, and is there a structure for it? So both the New Zealand and the Danish government are looking to, okay, what kind of partnerships can we build where we have some kind of public support mechanism for farmers who want to do things differently. In Norway, when it comes to some of these questions, they oftentimes say, well, our production system is great in the, biodiversity already, not least because, and the Norwegian government is actually oftentimes saying, well, biodiversity lives outside of the farm. So what they want from the farm policies just to make sure to produce enough food. So it's more about an increase in horticulture because so they're investing heavily in kind of like diversifying food production and having way more horticultural production. And if in the EU Farm to Fork, we can just see that there again, they take organic farming as the best way to kind of like take these agroecological practices into the food policy and use kind of like the organics market as the driver for a new alternative vision for the food system that encompasses way more on-field biodiversity. So what's driving the change at the moment, just like finishing off here, is that we see kind of like a seismic shift in the overall food discussion, but that shift is very much driven by climate change and the climate emergency, biodiversity loss, even though you can say food is actually an even bigger contributor to biodiversity loss than it is to climate change. Then climate change is still the driving force of what's really changing things at the moment and changing the global discussions, just compared to what was feasible to talk about, let alone think about 5 or 10 years ago. There are multitudes of possible correct ways forward, and there's a global agreement that we need to figure out locally, nationally, what's the right food system look like here. It needs to be adapted to culture and to how the farming sectors is organized, and of course to geographical food production, kind of like what's feasible in a country, right? We can see that big finance and the retailers, they are giving really strong market signals now. They haven't been doing that until perhaps this year, this COP, but now some of the biggest retailers in the UK, they just made a pledge. They want to go net zero. So again, it's very much the climate emergency driving change, but the big corporations and not least the big financiers can also see they need to figure out a way to finance the future of food, not the past. So we can see a lot of finances going into kind of like alternative food futures. And what we want to ensure is that it doesn't all go to lab produced meats, but some of that also go to kind of like the more niche phenomena. Because what we hope, the picture on the right here is one of my favorite pictures. The top is kind of like the global discussion, and suddenly we have this big change in how we talk globally around climate change. So that big change is kind of like nudging all the business. Okay, we need to figure out what to do. But then if we have all the good ideas on the bottom, if we have all the farmers who have some of the solutions, then a big change in the global discussion and a lot of new ideas that could be part of the future will be able to realign the system and really make us all think differently around what's feasible in a food system. So I think if we are clever, we can actually use this big discussion change around the climate emergency to also push more for a food system that's also optimized for biodiversity. We all need to adapt, and with well-assisted, with kind of like with good assistance from a public-private partnership, I think first movers in this field will be rewarded. And that's also why nations like New Zealand and Denmark, they want to be first movers into this field of, for Denmark's plant protein, for New Zealand, kind of like green beef, in order to be in the future marketplace. So that's it for me. I hope that's probably more for discussion than anything, but just some overarching thoughts. And I'm more than happy to dive into some of these in more detail afterwards.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mads. There's a real large number of points there to kind of think over. Just a quick question while perhaps Gemma's changing the slides. So from what I can gather, what you're saying is that we're at very early stages of this. So Scotland does have an opportunity to be one of those first movers, and the farmers that are here have an opportunity perhaps to influence the way in which it's going still.
Definitely. I think what's really important for Scotland is that we understand that we can't make our policies by looking in the rear mirror. For everyone in the world, food policy and agricultural policy, at least, have been very much about incrementality. We've just been in the same paradigm around kind of like slightly increased efficiency from farm bill to farm bill. And we need to understand that things in food and farming move slowly, but we need to see, okay, where are the markets 10, 15 years from now? Is it viable that we produce the same as we do? At the moment, we are already producing more meat than we are consuming in Scotland. What will the future markets of meat look like? So I think what's key for Scotland is to figure out what are our kind of like unique selling points from our products, and then also what will the future market look like. We can already see now that the Scottish the part of the Scottish food system that's making money, that's dairy, it's horticulture, and then it's whiskey and salmon. So beef and sheep farming has a really hard time making much money. Cereals too, to some degree. So will that correspond with what we expect from the markets going forward? Probably. So how can we carve out, if you want to be a meat farmer, a beef farmer, how can you carve out a market where you can ensure that you'll be relevant in the future? And for me, I would say then you need to be delivering on either probably just like climate as kind of like a minimum bar, kind of like a bar of entry point, and then delivering other green services on top of that. On the other hand, if you can be the green beef, then someone like me with a lot of money and fancy wine glasses behind me and stuff will probably pay you 3 or 4 times the amount of money for the same piece of meat that I could just go and buy in a local shop. So I think we have to figure out, okay, what will the future markets look like? There'll be a much smaller market for meat products in the future, and there'll be demand for local produced all the alternatives. And if we don't start figuring out what to produce in that, we risk getting overrun. But I think hopefully with a new agricultural policy and a good food nation, and hopefully those two can kind of like speak to one another and synergize, Scotland has a good opportunity to produce because we have good farmers, we have good landscapes, and we do have kind of like the start of the policy infrastructure that could lead us towards the future.
That's great, thank you, and that actually leads nicely into Ceri's presentation, who's going to talk about the trends in the market and things that are going to be driving perhaps change in the future based around biodiversity, etc. So over to you, Ceri.
Hi, forgot to unmute myself. Very unusual for me. Thank you, Paul, and thanks, Mads. A perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about today. And what I really wanted to say from at the start is that I've looked at some of the key consumer driving influences on food and drink. You know, what is driving consumer choice? So it dovetails very nicely into the policy outline there and the overview that Mads has given us. My second slide, thank you, Gemma, for driving my slides today. What I'm going to cover, I've looked at all the consumer drivers, the themes, the influences on consumer demand, and I've sort of narrowed them down into 5 key overall themes. And there are a number of influences that coalesce around our planet, around plant-based, around functional wellness, around a life well lived, and then I'm going to touch a little bit on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So if I start with the first of those in my next slide, there is a whole piece around things that are driving consumer behavior linked to care and concern about the planet. This includes things like sustainability, net zero, carbon footprint, plastics, packaging, upcycling and recycling. And I just really want to touch on a few of those things today. 85% of UK consumers have adopted at least one lifestyle change in order to become more sustainable in the last year. And 32% of UK consumers are considered to be highly engaged in sustainability, environment and environmental. So just think about that. I think when I'm talking about all these themes, think about what that means for biodiversity and the demand for services and products linked to biodiversity. That's the angle I'm coming from here. So the bare minimum by businesses and enterprises doesn't scrape anymore. It's not good enough for the consumers. The sustainability theme is really around a number of different things, and it presents its way across different demographics, and it depends very much on how knowledgeable the different consumers are and what demographic, what generation they're in. For some consumers, they want to understand their carbon footprint, they want to know it and believe that they're making real change. So the response there from the likes of Lidl is the traffic light system in terms of carbon emissions on some of their products, similar to how most of the UK supermarkets have dealt with nutritional information. For some consumers, it's all around organic or biodynamic, and that's the most important thing for them. And they're really interested in things like regenerative agriculture. So we need to think about how we produce food for that population, for that sector of the demographic. For you know, and you can think there in terms of you know, what's best for the planet, whether that's future eggs and farmed future baby foods, lots and lots of different brands. They're doing things in response to organic and biodynamic requirements. For some consumers, it's all around the sustainable sourcing of ingredients. So that could be like KitKat have done along the supply chain and talked about the sustainable sourcing of different elements of their product. For others, it's around animal welfare, and that's the key to sustainability. And they've and that's Mad mentioned lab-grown meat, but you know, a lot of the sort of concerns there around sustainability has led to a sort of interest in lab-grown meat. And meat and animal products are also controversial in terms of the carbon footprint. So there are many elements to this demand for increased sustainability. And I think key to thinking about that is, well, how does my enterprise on farm to increase biodiversity, how does that support and address some of those concerns? In terms of plastics and packaging, this is about both upcycling and recycling. 70% of consumers specifically choose products based on reducing plastic consumption. That's a huge percentage. And 70% of consumers always have their reusable bags with them when they're shopping. 58% of them keep their plastic bottles and reuse them. And that's led to the marketing of the reusability of packaging and things like that. But still, 42% of consumers are just throwing away their plastic bottles straight away. So there's a real divergence in what's happening out there in the marketplace. Linked to this, we've seen the growth of refill stores and refilleries. Asda's operating refillery aisles in some of the London stores. Morrison's are doing that nationwide. There's a farm shop near me that's just opened up, and it's all about refillery. It's all about replenishing and using things and being conscious about the packaging. But this is also about product innovation as well. So like the cheese pack you can see on the slide there, that's really making a big thing about, you know, being reusable, recyclable, less plastic. You'll see there the loaf from the B&M stores, you know, you've got an outlet like that, just thinking about rise up against plastic. So that whole piece around recyclability of packaging, and if you can't recycle it in the domestic place, it's saying take it back to the supermarket, and there's specific provision there for certain bags and things. So this whole concern around the positive impact and the care of the planet is really important to consumers, and it's important when we're thinking about what things the impact that has on what we develop for biodiversity on farm. If I can go to the next slide, Gemma, please. And this is the second key theme, and that's all around plant-based. Now, plant-based is here to stay, whether we like it or not. It's not just for vegetarians or vegans, it's actually here to stay. And Mads actually mentioned there when he was talking about Denmark, how they're really honing in and looking at plant alternatives. And just as we heard from when I talk about our planet theme, animal-derived products, again, are causing some of the biggest climate controversies at the moment, and this is driving some of the demand for plant-based. The Euromonitor and Health Nutrition Survey conducted in February last year said that 4%, this is globally, but 4% of consumers are claiming to be vegan, 6% are claiming to be vegetarian, but a staggering 42% of them have some sort of animal and product eating restriction. So that's quite huge. And 42% of them are actively looking for more plant-based options. So this is here to stay. And some examples there on the screen around you know, cow's milk's made for cows, you know, and it's not radical, and drink oat milk, which is made for humans. These are some of the marketing tricks, not tricks, the marketing ways these products are being marketed and the way they're coming to them. So actually thinking about, why are they doing that? Why are they doing that in that way? And that's really important. Another thing that's really important is Generation Z. So that's like my son's generation. So those in their early 20s, they have the most consumers restricting their use of animal derived produce. 54% of them are trying to reduce animal derived consumption. At the other end of the scale, baby boomers, which is my generation, we're the least likely to restrict meat consumption. However, 34% of my age group are still trying to reduce meat consumption. So again, some massive things going on in this space. And there's some examples there of the Beyond the Meat burger that's launching McDonald's, Subway using Beyond Meat meatballs. There's a huge variety of products now that we're seeing. It's no longer an alternative, it's a mainstream option in the supermarkets. And then if I can just look at the next slide, which is all around functional wellness. And this is about foods that do something for you and do something for your body. So wellness can also be linked to the well-being economy, but it's about health-related concerns. So it includes pre, pro, and postbiotics and all that around digestive wellness, the issues around inflammation, weight wellness, and immunity. And the foods on the right-hand side of this slide, coalescing around the red shapes there, they are all functional foods, and they have a benefit to you when you consume them. So it might be more energy or a better sleep. And a few years ago, when we looked at functional foods, it was all around things like Red Bull and how that helps do X, Y, and Z. But now it's about natural functionalness. It's about functional whole foods. And that's a real shift in the functional foods market. Customers are now looking for clean label. They want to see as little as possible going into the product, and they want to see most of the whole food. And there's been a huge increase in the use of functional foods over the last 5 years. Some of that will be around the growth of availability of functional foods, but there's definitely a drive from the consumers wanting to really be positive and proactive about what they put in their body and what it does to them. And the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the long national health backlogs, this has really driven some of this. People have found it difficult to seek medical help, so they've tried to almost turn to food as a medicine. And 1 in 5 people have IBS, 1 in 650 people have Crohn's disease, 5 in 100 people are lactose intolerant, 1 in 100 people have celiac disease. So there's a huge issue here. And foods, as you'll see on the screen, foods are really homing in on this and starting to highlight what they can do in terms of helping you to help your body. I won't go through each of those foods individually because I'm conscious of the time, but you can see there the likes of Kellogg's shouting about immunity, Actimel shouting about immune support, Innocent, where the Generation Zs of this world have grown up with their smoothies, they're now calling to that generation saying, hey, there's a shield here. My product can help shield you from this, that, and the other. So there's a whole range of the way foods are now being marketed that's addressing this consumer need. And if I can move to the next slide, Gemma. This slide, life well lived, I hope, I feel I identify with this a lot, and I'm hoping you can also identify this. And I think this is where there's a real opportunity to link in with the growth and development and support of biodiversity, as well as the planet and the care of our planet. But within life well lived, we're talking about living life slower, and there's a bit of self-indulgence in there, but guilt-free self-indulgence. There was a survey done recently across 6 countries, and 79% of consumers, including the UK, believe that wellness is really important to them, and 42% of those surveyed consider wellness as a top priority. So people want more from their time, they're reassessing that work-life balance, and 41% of the global workforce are actually considering leaving their current work role. So some of this is coming out of the pandemic, but people have really started to think about how they live their lives, and are there ways they can live their lives slower and in a more mindful way. So there's mindfulness practice, there's mindful eating, taking time not only to be careful about what you're eating and clear about what you're eating and care about what you're eating, but also enjoy the process of eating, the cooking, the sharing with friends, the whole sort of raising up eating and drinking into a different level. Linked into this is also self-care. That's really important. Self-indulgence is a trend within self-care. It's about guilt-free indulgence, thinking about treating yourself, but treating yourself to the right things. Now you can link that back to what New Zealand are trying to do, as Mads said. Okay, I'm going to eat meat, but I'm going to eat less meat, but more quality, high quality meat that's been produced and grown with care for all the other things that I care about, environment, climate, etc. So 58% of consumers are seeking products that are proactively going to improve their health and well-being, this self-care piece. And you'll see in food service settings and retail settings, you'll see this start to come through in the way people are marketing their product, the way restaurants and cafes are talking about their experience, the way that some rural and indeed urban service provision, experience provision is really homing in on this. So a hugely important theme there. If I can just go on to the second life well lived slide, please, Gemma. This is about a bit more about guilt-free consumption, and that's not just about being not feeling guilty about the planet, but it's also about alleviating social guilt. Consumers expect businesses to do more than just make a profit these days. Their ethics are really important. What they're doing for their community, what they're doing for charity, what they're doing for the greater good is really important to consumers today, and it gives you an opportunity to actually promote and market on that level as well. I think linked into this is a bit of growth around low and no alcohol. That's a huge trend now. You only need to look at the space provision in supermarkets to see that, you know, it's no longer a couple of facings. It's actually a huge part of the gondola, the supermarket shelves. So that's really important, and that's linked to still feeling you're enjoying yourself and stuff, and having a drink, but having a drink and being kind to your body and looking after yourself. And it's a whole re-education there, and there's a huge percentage now of younger generation particularly that are choosing not to drink alcohol. And again, that's really important. And you'll see some of the larger brands and some of the smaller brands now having a low or no alcohol variant. So, you know, many years ago it used to be the likes of Seedlit coming in being a no alcoholic alternative. Now you'll see brands that have alcohol and low or no alcohol. Provenance is important here, but the thing I want to say about provenance is not a place. Provenance means different things to different people. It means different things in different product categories. If you're talking about spirits, then the skilled Scottish specialists in that sector are considered provenance in the spirits market. If you're thinking about fish, it's good for the Scottish economy, it's environmental, that whole sort of supporting Scotland. If you're thinking about meat, provenance is all around freshly Scottish farmed, so that Scottish quality image. So really important there. And I want to just bring wild foods in here. Mads and I have done some a deal of work in this wild food sector, and certainly this growth in interest and partaking of and understanding and experimenting with wild foods is a huge opportunity here, and it's growing. And some of this is a bit about rewilding yourself. We've heard of people rewilding the countryside, but there's a bit of a trend in here about rewilding yourself and that primal fitness, rewilding your body, but also rewilding your mind. And again, just think about all the links. I've just got a couple more slides, conscious of time here, but if I can just go to the next slide, and this is really just bringing together some of the things I've already said, and this is the impact of COVID-19. No one person has not been impacted by COVID-19. There's a few negatives in there, so everybody has been impacted by COVID-19. And some of the key impacts have been that people have started to reassess what is important to them. So all those trends I've just talked about, all of those take some of the strains in the detail of what's happening from the impact of the pandemic. And people have started to think about mindfulness, to think about stress-free, to think about community, to think about ethics, to think about how to look after your body, to protect your body, immunity, so on and so forth. 85%, as I said, of UK consumers in 2020 have adopted at least one lifestyle change. And much of that, as I said, is around sustainability. The source of that is Deloitte, April 2021. Kantar also tell us, and that's Kantar this year as well, that as a result of the pandemic, 48% of consumers think sustainability is more important to them than anything. So how do we build that into the offering, and how do we link that to growth in biodiversity, or an enterprise built around biodiversity? I've got in the next slide just a wee little list there about requirements. Now, I'm an ex-supermarket buyer. I worked as a category manager in a supermarket, and then for the last 30 years I've spent advising smaller businesses based here in Scotland, some large businesses as well. And what I've done here is that whether you're developing a product that's around biodiversity, or whether you're developing what's the word I'm looking for, an experience around biodiversity, it's really important to understand what the market is looking for. And that's why we've just spent 15 minutes looking at themes and consumer drivers at the moment. You have to be market led, and nothing will make up for a lack of research. You know, if you're looking at products, 75% of new products fail in the first 2 years. So you need to get it right. You need to understand what's happening in the marketplace. And it's easier today than it's ever been, you know, online, blah, blah, blah. When I started out, didn't have a computer, didn't have online, used to go to a library, used to interview consumers, blah, 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 blah. So it's a lot more easier than it has ever been. And it's really important to be market driven. So understand what's happening in the marketplace, what's driving the consumers that you are trying to target. The other thing that's really important is to think about the story. What's your value proposition? What is setting you, your business, your service, whatever, whether it's a product or a service, whatever you're doing, what is setting you aside from everybody else? You know, what need, what's your why, what's your need? Why would somebody want to buy your product? Why would somebody want to visit your farm to go to your flower field, or to engage in an experience? Why? And understanding that and creating a story around that will serve you well. Be mindful, every product or service has a life cycle, and it start off slow, it will grow quickly, it will then start to mellow out and mature. And catching it there before it starts dipping and going into decline is really important. And the only way you do that is by keeping an eye on the market, keeping an open mind, and thinking about how you keep developing and thinking about how you keep that interest there for your customers. And that takes me to my last point around keep innovating and keep looking at the marketplace. The last slide there, Gemma, thank you. I've just put some hyperlinks into the podcasts and videos we've done before, but I think Paul will talk about that. So that's all I've got to say just now. I'm happy to take questions now or at the end. Thank you for listening.
Sorry, I did a Ceri there and didn't unmute. Thanks, Ceri. That was great. That was a really quick run through, but that really just set the scene of the marketplace and picks up on Mad's points really well. So finally, we come on to Alex, who we've heard a bit about the market and the policies that are driving that market, etc., etc. With Alex, we're hopefully going to hear a bit around the practicalities on the farm. So, kind of what can you do, and how do you go about doing it, and you know, what are the implications? What are the sort of do's and don'ts to some extent? So, I'll hand over to Alex. Again, I'm just a bit conscious of the time as well.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for having me here tonight. It's really good to be with you. As Paul said at the start, my name's Alexander Perry. I am a consultant working out of the Auchengrove office here in Ayrshire. Paul and I both work on SAC's AgriCalc development team, and I'm also the facilitator for the Net Zero Arran group here in the Southwest. So we're working to quantify the carbon footprint of the entire island from an agricultural perspective, but also building in more and more conservation measures into what we're doing. So can I go to the next slide, please, Jim? So yeah, I think just building off what Mads and Ceri have already said, you know, obviously this is a pretty tumultuous time for biodiversity conservation. It's a really interesting time. We're just coming off the backdrop of COP. I don't know if any of the listeners, the viewers, have seen the Nature's Dangerous Decline document that was published last year, just highlighting global trends in biodiversity conservation and the kind of state of play of the world's conservation. You can see I've tried to pick out a couple of statistics there that link back into the food production story, but there's obviously a lot to be concerned with there. We'll just take a look in the next slide about how Scotland is doing in comparison to the rest of the world. Okay, so as we said on the run up to the presentation tonight, I am aware that there's no bears in Scotland, at least not yet. But I do like to think that this bear is having a good long thought about Scotland and how we're doing in terms of our biodiversity targets. So Scotland's 2020 biodiversity challenge was set out, and Scottish Government sought to achieve 20 targets or outcomes. Now, Nature Scot published their report just last month, which suggested that we're actually on track to achieve 9 out of 20 of those, with significant progress having been made on the 11 other ones. Now, that might seem like a very pessimistic message for the industry. However, just to place it in a bit of context, while we're on track to achieve 9 out of the 20, we're actually, you know, significant progress has been made in moving towards those outcomes, and there's not a single outcome within the report at which we're reversing, we're backsliding, or there's been no improvement. So I think it's really important that we get some positive messages over to the various sectors within the industry and let them know that we're moving in the right direction. And yes, farmers are conscious of their biodiversity conservation requirements, and that the industry is adapting. You can see there that 71% of Scots report an increased awareness of the importance of biodiversity conservation, and to me that's a huge plus. And we heard a little earlier on about how public perception and public demand is driving the markets, and in a lot of ways driving policy before Scottish Government has a chance to develop it. Equally, the report also highlighted that incentives to help farmers and indeed other members of the general public move in more of a biodiversity friendly manner. Not quite there yet, and that's a big takeaway from the report. And I would encourage anybody who's got time to take a chance to go through it. It really is, it's a relatively short summary document right now, and there will be more findings to come out from it, but a really interesting read. Next slide, please. Okay, so obviously we're just coming off of COP26. I don't know how the attendees feel. I don't know how the other presenters feel, but I think that on balance, there were some really positive messages that came out of it. I was fortunate enough to see a number of the presentations, and one of the highlights for me certainly was Idris Elba's panel on food security and sustainability globally. I think that was really positive to get, like I say, some good messages out there. We're fortunate enough that in the backdrop of COP, Scottish Government felt the need to make some policy announcements with regards to how we as farmers, landowners, crofters go about making investment in biodiversity conservation measures on farm. So for those of you who might be familiar, the AgriEnvironment Climate Scheme is due to return for next year and an additional 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. Can I just get a raise of hands or a mention in the chat as to whether or not the listeners are familiar with the AgriEnvironment Climate Scheme? Fantastic. So there's a couple of you there. That's great. So the AgriEnvironment Climate Scheme is Scotland's flagship conservation scheme. And the idea is that farmers and landowners, crofters who are interested in biodiversity conservation can receive recurring annual management payments, which are supported by capital payments for the delivery of set environmental outcomes. And these can be things like the establishment of species-rich native grassland, wader and wildlife mown grassland, wader grazed grassland, where you implement a grazing exclusion period for the benefit of ground nesting wading birds. And there are options for water margin management, the management of hedges and other linear features like dry stone dikes, as well as the more traditional options for moorland management, deer control, summer hill grazing of cattle on moorlands and things like heather restoration. So it's a really exciting scheme. There's a lot of really great options there. And then I would encourage anybody who's interested who may not be participating right now to seriously consider it going forward into 2022. Historically, the scheme's had a bit of a rough transition recently. We're just coming off the back of a restricted funding round, which was restricted in that to be eligible for funding support, you had to be located on a designated site or undertaking management that was beneficial to a designated nature site. That was purely reflective of the fact that we were coming off of Brexit. There were a lot of budgetary concerns, and Scottish Government weren't in the position to fully fund the scheme. But going forward, I think we've seen a really positive message from Scottish Government that they're prepared and they're confident in the scheme and they can deliver for biodiversity conservation across Scotland. Is anybody in the group familiar with the Nature Restoration Fund? No, okay, fantastic. So the Nature Restoration Fund was a trial project that was launched by Nature Scot last year. So it was just in the pilot phase. We're hoping that it will come back for another round of funding next year. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the new entrant capital grant scheme that was available in the late 2010s. I like to think of it very much like a new entrant capital grant, but for conservation. The idea with the Nature Restoration Fund being that you detail a project proposal for Nature Scot and for Scottish Government. They will evaluate the merits of your proposal, and that can be totally open to yourself. There are 5 overall objectives, which, you know, it's good to hit a couple of these. These included options for habitat creation, hydrology, which is benefiting the water environment, urbanization. So yes, the funding objectives for the Nature Restoration Fund broadly fit into habitat creation and management, urbanization, hydrology, and then there's options to support coastal and marine projects, and also the management and eradication of invasive and non-native species. So I think these broadly are indicative of Scottish Government's priorities for where we want to be with biodiversity conservation. And like I say, it it's very much a capital grant. So rather than getting a 5-year management contract, you're looking at developing a project and delivering it over a number of months as opposed to years. So for those of you looking for a very specific project that can be achieved over a very short period of time, it's definitely something to consider. And the third one I've got there is the Working for Waders Small Fund. I don't know if many of you have utilised the fund. I don't know if you've come across Working for Waders as an organisation, but they have launched the small fund now for 2 years, and the idea being that waders in particular are national priority species. They have a protected designation by Scottish Government. So generally, management that will enhance the habitat that you have on your farm, or indeed create new habitat, will be viewed as beneficial to them and will be supported. Now, it's a small fund, sorry, I should say it's a small grant with a maximum eligible cap of £3,000, and generally that's towards things like the creation of wader scrapes, or cutting of rush pasture. It can also include options for predator control. We know that ground nesting wading birds come under increasing threat from things like predatory corvid species, or foxes who will inevitably take eggs or destroy nests, disturb birds during the breeding period. And there's also a nice tie in there with some of the objectives of the AgriEnvironment climate scheme. You know, I talked about wader grazed grassland and the need for an exclusion period. So very much complementary schemes, and I think a good indication of where we're going in terms of biodiversity conservation, and also the impact of seeing some of the green influence on Scottish Government going forward in their coalition. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a general baseline starting point, when you're looking at what kind of biodiversity conservation measures you want to undertake on the farm, you want to be undertaking a farm environment assessment. And the idea with the farm environment assessment is that you create this baseline, very much along the lines of a carbon audit, where you're evaluating the stocks that you have, you're calculating the emissions that you're creating, and you're taking stock of your carbon sequestration. Very much along those lines, you're also taking stock of the different unique habitats that you have on the farm, where they are, what kind of condition they're currently in, and where they interact, and where there's compounded benefits from complementary management. Also, what are your priorities in terms of biodiversity conservation on the farm? I mentioned earlier on that the waders have a national priority species protection. I would encourage anybody who's interested in what the national priority species are to take a look at the FAS website. We've just developed a range of videos around a number of national priority species. So anybody who's thinking about the Nature Restoration Fund or the AgriEnvironment Climate Scheme going forward, I would encourage you to take a look at that and really drill down onto the species that you think are likely to be present on your farm. Also, it's worth saying that there are a number of different advisory bodies that are prepared to help you out with this, and Nature Scot in particular have been very good at driving the conversation when you're coming to building your farm environment assessment, and indeed any kind of environmental application that you may be working on, particularly where you're farming on a designated nature site. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when it comes to identifying the opportunities that you have on your farm, you want to look across your boundaries. You want to have a broad approach to what species are in your vicinity and what options can you undertake that could reasonably be seen to be beneficial to them. Linear features that I mentioned there are really handy when you're looking at creating interlinked habitats. Worthwhile saying though that there are some features and some habitats that were you to invest in them, were you to enhance them, it may not necessarily be to the benefit of all species. A good example of this is, for example, curlew. The ground nesting wading birds typically do not like nesting or being present within the vicinity of dense woodland, or to an extent along hedgerows. The idea being that they are afraid of predatory birds using the cover of trees to predate on nests, on eggs, and on them themselves. So yes, taking a look at the stocks that you have on the farm is really important, and particularly when we're talking about these native species, your species-rich grassland and benefiting pollinators, your open grazed grassland for benefiting waders, and like I say, where you have a larger, more expansive moorland that may or may not be protected, we can look at national priority species like hen harrier, twite, black grouse. You'll often find that your regional priorities will be set by groups like RSPB or NatureScot, and in particular, those of you who might be interested in the AgriEnvironment climate scheme, you will have a set of management options that are available to you, and those will be based on your location code of the business. And that's purely reflective of the national priorities that Scottish Government want to see you contribute to and help achieve in terms of biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. Okay, so once you've come to identify what your sensitive habitats are, it's really important that you implement an appropriate grazing plan or a management plan. It doesn't necessarily need to incorporate livestock. I've used the example here of species-rich native pasture. And as a general rule of thumb, I would always suggest to people that when it comes to managing this kind of habitat, we're looking at a light spring grazing to prepare the habitat for the summer. We're wanting to remove that dense, matted, old grassland that may have accumulated over winter. We're then looking to implement a break period through the summer. Now, I've mentioned the ground nesting wading birds there. You could, were you to decide to go down that avenue, to build it into benefiting ground nesting wading birds and excluding livestock. Similarly, you could be implementing a break period just for the benefit of pollinators and to allow flowers and plants to set seed. And this would typically be followed up by a harder period of winter grazing or back-end grazing. Again, just to remove excess vegetation and to incorporate a layer of dung, of livestock manure, of plant matter back into the soil. Also, worth saying here, I've got another link here, that's for our technical note, which is the conservation grazing of semi-natural habitats. And it just kind of breaks it down on a per habitat basis, the kind of grazing and stocking densities that you're looking to achieve across different sensitive habitats. Next slide, please. Okay, I did feel that it was important that we mention and talk about moorlands specifically. Obviously, moorlands and the hill environment are synonymous with Scotland. There's great heritage factor there. There's great landscape character factors there. It's an area where we typically have a lot of cattle, a lot of sheep. There's a lot of agricultural activity happening in the uplands. And it's also an area where there is a uniquely high concentration of protected designated features. So when we're talking about designated features, we could be talking about things like upland protected birch woodland. We could be talking about things like the national priority species, so hen harrier and black grouse. We could be talking about deer management and across. And certainly when it comes to the AgriEnvironment climate scheme, Scottish Government have demonstrated that they have a particular interest in the sustainable management of the farmed upland environment. So whether that's along the lines of options for summer hill grazing of cattle, deer management, the various capital items that they have to support sustainable management. So we're looking at the control of invasive scrub species, options for rhododendron clearance, as well as options for heather restoration, deer fencing, stock fencing. There really is, well, it's not an endless list, but it feels like that sometimes. And there's certainly a benefit to be had from protecting your vulnerable upland habitats. Particularly in the next 10 years, I sat down very recently for a podcast with Peter Cairns, who is the Chief Executive of Scotland, the Big Picture. And one of the things that we discussed was the increase in peatland restoration and how that was becoming a greater priority for Scottish Government. And I think it demonstrates how the farmed upland environment, but in particular these hills that we typically think as the least productive areas of our farms, are going to become increasingly important. And I think the advent and the increasing in things like carbon auditing is really showing that off. Next slide, please. Okay, now I appreciate that some of the things that I potentially talk about in tonight's presentation might conflict a little bit with what Mads and Ceri have said. I would argue that there is an issue with conflicting priorities. So when we're talking about building biodiversity conservation on farms, we need to be very clear that, you know, some actions which can improve biodiversity across farms may not necessarily be good for our carbon footprint. I do a lot of work within the dairy sector here in Ayrshire, and a lot of very highly productive dairy farms with great carbon footprints, although granted they have high emissions. I do think it's fair to say that were some of these farms to implement some of the changes that I might advocate for an upland farm, they would see a reduction in their overall efficiency, and there is that drawback there. So I think it's about finding balance. But as I mentioned there, conservation need not be in conflict necessarily. When we look at things like beneficial insects and biological control for things like your arable crops, there's definitely scope to be had to build in biodiversity for the benefit of the business. Another good example, I just mentioned dairy farms there. We're seeing a push here in Ayrshire to increase the implementation of bat boxes around dairy farms, and the idea with that being that we could potentially see a reduction in fly strike within the productive herd. So there really is no excuse for not taking some action. It's about being clever, it's about being strategic with what we're doing and trying to build that into our productive business. Next slide, please. Okay, so just on the wind down here, I just wanted to summarize that we as an industry probably know that farming is changing, that the Scottish Government have expressed a desire to see farms across Scotland, crofts, small farms, provide public goods, and that natural capital is going to be a really important facet of that. Whether that's things like water filtration, promoting pollinators, carbon capture, the provision of multi-species and multi-herbal ways for soil conditioning. There's really no end to the services that Scotland can provide, that Scotland's landowners can provide, and we need to be prepared and be proactive when it comes to that. I don't want to talk overly about the dairy sector here in Ayrshire, but we have seen commitments within the dairy sectors in particular here to build in regenerative principles into their farming structures. And I think that's an example of how they can contribute to the biodiversity crisis without necessarily compromising the productivity that they're striving to maintain. Next slide, please. So although things are changing, I would just ask you all to take a deep breath. We do have a serious problem ahead of us, and we have a serious challenge. One of the things that I'm quite optimistic about, though, is that provided we stay the course, we implement change, we stick to the timescales in which we want to see that change become reality, and we're consistent in delivering that, we can meet the challenges of climate change and biodiversity decline and maintain profitable businesses. And I've kind of outlined 3 things here that I think that we should be paying particular attention to. I think that the case for grazing livestock has to be made. We know that there's a climate change issue with ruminant livestock in particular, but I would argue that we cannot view grazing livestock in a vacuum, and that there's absolutely a case that they're great for habitat conservation. We know that their cattle in particular are great conservation grazers of semi-natural and unimproved habitats. That's why, for example, Scottish Government have encouraged options for summer hill grazing of cattle in the AgriEnvironment climate scheme. That's why they have funded and continue to support the retention and introduction of cattle into small crofting units through the AgriEnvironment climate scheme. I think the case is there to be made for livestock, and we just need to take a more holistic approach with it. But I certainly wouldn't contest that there is a climate change problem there with ruminant livestock. I think that it's important that we qualify and quantify our natural capital reserves. There's a lot of work being done right now into outcomes-based environmental planning and outcomes-based environmental schemes. It's highly likely that they're going to be the successor schemes to the AgriEnvironment climate scheme when it does phase out or come to an end. And I think the outcomes-based stuff is really interesting. It offers farmers and landowners the opportunity to set their own targets and to be innovative in how they go about achieving it. One of the criticisms of the AgriEnvironment climate scheme, for example, is that it's often seen as very prescriptive. That is a fair criticism from a lot of farmers out there. I think that moving towards an outcomes-based scheme offers the potential for farmers to have a bit more of control over how it is that they achieve what they're setting out to. And I think we're having this presentation in the backdrop of probably historically high inorganic fertilizer prices. And I think that as an industry, farming has to become smarter about how we tap into the natural processes that are happening on the farm, whether that's in the context of organic farming or regenerative agriculture, or people are talking about holistic management now. I think that inputs are always going to be with us to a certain extent, but it's about how we become smarter and how we use them and how they tie into the bigger picture. All right. Next slide, please. So that's me, folks. But like the rest of the speakers, I'm quite happy to take any questions that you have, particularly with regards to any of the schemes that I mentioned, but also more broadly, if any of you have any conservation questions.
That's great. Thanks very much, Alice. That was really good, very comprehensive. That's I think that's sort of rounded up the three presentations really well. Thank you. We don't appear to have any questions in the chat at the moment, or unless anybody can see them, but I can't. I'm like Alex, I disappeared for a while and then came back again. So it wasn't just you, Alex. It was, there was something wrong, I think, in the system. I'm
not sure if you can type anything in the chat. I haven't been able to, so maybe people can just...
Okay, well, if not, then yes, I was going to say, if anybody does have a question, yes, then please come off. Yeah, do it in real life, or come off mute anyway.
Can I just guess?
I was just going to come in and say I can actually see the questions in the chat if you would like me to read them out. For some reason,
please,
everyone left for me.
Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question here for Mad. So Mad said that he thought that organic meat has a higher carbon print but better for habitat, but then it said New Zealand is going down organic route. I think, can you clarify?
Yeah, I think it's also, it resonates a little bit with Alex's last point here, that sometimes there are completing priorities. So sometimes what's good for biodiversity isn't necessarily the best for climate. And we need a food system that can encompass both. So for instance, the National Food Strategy for England suggests, okay, we need some really high yielding industrial agriculture. We need that to feed the world, and we need that to feed Britain. But then we also need some part of the food system in Britain that has that's more for conserving of nature and biodiversity in the fields. And I think where you just, as a food producer and as a farmer, you need to figure out where do you want to be, because we probably, if we try to do it all, we might risk not doing any of the things well enough. So I think carving out also, as Ceri alluded to, figuring out where in the market do I fit with my product, because the days of just like producing a lot of exactly the same thing to a bulk market and assuming that you can make a decent living on that 10, 15 years down the road is probably over. So I would say, okay, where do we fit in the market? And going to New Zealand, I'm not sure they go necessarily for organics. If I said that, I have probably been wrong. They are very much focusing on how can they be delivering kind of like green services that the world needs. And what the New Zealand government is eyeing is they think their key markets are mostly concerned about climate change. Thus, the New Zealand farmers, they want to figure out how can they keep producing livestock, but do it more climate efficient than anyone else, and thus having a market advantage over someone like us, if they can, for instance, be the first to figure out how to make sure that sheep doesn't emit methane from burping. So they are on the try to reduce climate emissions as much as possible from current livestock production at the moment.
Perfect, thank you. That's actually the only question in the chat. There's just a comment about tree planting will not help wager birds for a later presentation.
Can I just add a comment to that? I think the science is really important here, but I think also that's important is the way that a business tells its story, you know, in terms of what it highlights. And as Mads says there, you know, the first to get in, to be seen to be doing something. You know, we're a fickle bunch, us consumers. You know, we will move around, but we also, you know, we listen to a story. And I think there's that whole piece around, you know, how businesses, enterprises, farms, whatever the rural business may well be, the way they tell the story and how compelling they are is really important in this.
And I don't, if I may just add one thing that I sped through and focused on the policy development side of things. But in Denmark, I was involved in a couple of research projects to try to, can we kind of link biodiversity? How can we figure out, how can we create a market for the biodiversity, the foods that are also good for biodiversity? And we tried with all kinds of science to figure out, okay, can we kind of show that if we have like these flowery meadows, you can then taste it in the cheese from the meadows, thus the cheese tastes differently, and then consumers will pay more. And most of those tests were in vain because consumers couldn't taste the difference. But if you told the consumers this comes from a very flowery meadow, suddenly the consumer could taste the difference. We see that also with salmon, just a recent study. Well, consumers in Denmark, they prefer non-organic farmed salmon in blind test. But then if they're told what they're eating, they prefer organic salmon, then wild caught salmon, and they dislike the farmed salmon. So in that way, the storytelling aspect and the narrative aspect is also triggering us as consumers very, very much. So that's why I hope that the Scottish government will ensure that the Good Food Nation bill that could provide the storytelling, could provide some of the tools to engage with the marketplace, goes hand in hand with the agricultural bill, so they aren't just two separate items. Because we need to see farming not just as providing some kind of raw material into a food system, but also farmers as narrators and storytellers. That's where some of the financial benefits for doing the right thing for biodiversity will also lie, not just in metrics, but also in storytelling.
Sorry, Gemma, can you just reiterate that again? There was a comment about wading birds.
Yeah, there was a comment from someone in the chat about tree planting will not help wader birds.
Yep, yeah. So I couldn't agree more. I think I probably mentioned that in the presentation. I do think that for a while there, we as a nation were fixated on tree planting, which is obviously great for climate change mitigation. But yeah, there is a danger that we go ahead and end up planting habitats that has a nature conservation value that is less obvious to us. And I think therein lies the argument for the development of some kind of biodiversity calculator. You know, we've seen the development of carbon calculators now, and they've been great tools for farmers to make improvements, and they've been great to inform Scottish Government in terms of where they want to see policy move. But it's just a bit more complicated with biodiversity conservation, and you know, how do you differentiate the value of a wader versus the value of great yellow bumblebee, for example? You know, different people will have different opinions, and it's about building that consensus there. But I take your point, and I totally agree on the tree issue.
That's all the questions in the chat. Oh, sorry.
Do you have something, Gemma?
Nope, nothing else in the chat.
I think on the last, how can we kind of like, what kind of biodiversity should we reward and how much? It can, if you really dive into kind of like all the sustainability issues regarding our food system and how we farm, it just gets extraordinarily complicated. We've also just seen, just even if you just single out, for instance, carbon and say, okay, we want kind of like a label for that. A lot of people want that, or carbon tax, and it's just too complicated because we are dealing with the living things. We can't just calculate it. It's really hard, and a tomato in summer is very different from a tomato in winter, etc., etc. So I think from a policy side of things, as I showed both with Denmark and with the EU, the way they try to incorporate this is through organic and promoting the organic market. So it's not necessarily good for all species to convert into organics, but on average, an organic farmland will be a little bit better for biodiversity than a non-organic farmland, and it'll also have less impact on like surrounding waterways, etc. So I think, for me as a former bureaucrat and a civil servant, I'd probably opt for like an ambitious organic policy if I was to choose, because it's really hard to solve some of the other biodiversity issues on the fields. Then you have to kind of like preserve the waders in kind of like a different scheme that's more about opening up more nature, preserving more natural lands. But I think that's where at least the European discourse is going, is to see organics as the key way to promote on-farm biodiversity. I'd imagine. I'm not sure we will take that road here, so it's going to be interesting to see how the future agricultural subsidies will line up here, and how we can create a market for the better product, if it's all down to storytelling, or if we can develop fancier metrics than people in the European Union, or whether we'll opt for kind of like the same middle of the road broad perspectives around organics. I would probably think we'll end up there, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, totally agree with that point, Mads. I think I may not have mentioned it earlier in the presentation, but certainly in terms of organics and facilitating organic conversion, the AgriEnvironment Climate Scheme does provide support funding for 5-year contracts for conversion and then maintenance. So we have seen historically farms converting through the AgriEnvironment Climate Scheme. There has actually been a huge uptake in the level of interest we've seen this year in terms of organic farming. I suspect a lot of that is just coming down to panic with the increasing inorganic fertilizer prices, and that may very well settle, and that situation will sort itself out. But I do think, you know, regardless of whether or not you're farming organically, there are certainly lessons to be taken away from organic systems and implemented into conventional farming.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I'm just conscious of the time, so I think we're probably better wrap up there. But I think one thing that, well, there's many things I've taken away from this, but one thing that it strikes me from listening to all three speakers and the sort of comments in the conversations is that this isn't just a farming problem. It's an industry one, and it's the industry that's going to solve it, and that includes the consumer to some degree, because if they're not going to buy the food that we put on the shelf that might be, or be prepared to pay a little bit extra, say for organic produce or something that's been produced to enhance biodiversity, then it won't happen, because at the end of the day, price sort of trumps everything, or economics trumps everything when it comes to business. So I think we've a lot to learn. It's a long way to go, and it's got to include everybody in sort of collaboration, I think, in trying to get this right for Scotland. So yeah, we'll wrap it up there. I'd just like to say thank you very much to Mads, Ceri and Alex. That was really good, excellent presentations, I thought, and really interesting, thought-provoking. Thanks to Gemma in the background for keeping the slides and the technology and letting me back in about 3 times when the internet went off. And just to say, for those of you that are still on, this has been recorded and will go onto the FAS website in the next couple of weeks or so, once we've got it sort of processed and on there. So if there is anything you missed or want to go over anything, then you'll be able to watch it there and pick it up, or recommend it to friends and contacts to have a look at, because I thought this was a really good session tonight. So thanks very much. Have a good evening. And if you are traveling, safe journey, but otherwise take care, and we'll hopefully see you again soon. Thank you.